We're live.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ICHRRF monthly Speaking Up series. My name is Dr. Adityanji. Today is Sunday, December 14, 2025. It is 10 a.m. Eastern Time. May I have my PowerPoint, please? So you can see our logo. Let's go to the next slide, please. And that shows the actual logo. On behalf of the ICHRRF, the Board of Directors, as well as the executive team, I welcome all of our audience members, wherever they are, for the monthly Speaking Up series. Let's move on to the next slide, please. A little bit about ICHRRF. International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom is a US-based nonprofit focused on upholding human rights and religious freedom all over the world through continuous monitoring, policy intervention, and collaboration. We are focused on educational, research, legal, and human rights advocacy and charitable purposes. We strive to be an advocate for the human rights and religious freedom of underrepresented communities across the world, wherever they may be, including in the United States. We believe that humankind can no longer afford to be selectively vocal about the rights of only a specific set of people. A just and humane world necessitates fair treatment of all living beings. Our focus at ICHRRF is for indigenous rights and freedom, free speech, and the cultural preservation of indigenous communities. Therefore, at the ICHRRF, we try to and strive to be the voice of the voiceless people. Next slide, please. Some of our initiatives include monitoring violations of the freedom and sanctity of religious and philosophical minorities across the world, research into and documentation of the culture, history, and challenges faced by such marginalized communities, policy recommendations on human rights, religious diversity, and pluralism to international organizations, agencies, national and local governments, collaboration to support the cultural and philosophical diversity across the world. We do have Professor Ved P. Nanda Memorial Fellowship Training Program, and we just finished our third scheduled international conference on October 9th and 10th, 2025. Next slide, please. So the topic for today's oration is second class in their own homeland, discrimination against Zoroastrians in Iran. And our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Sousan Abadian. So welcome, Dr. Sousan.
Thank you so much.
Of course, we are talking about Zoroastrian. So that is a fire temple, Zoroastrian temple. Next slide, please. So Dr. Sousan is currently Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington. In addition to her work at IFC, she also teaches, coaches, and consults internationally on leadership, building on her earlier work with Cambridge Leadership Associates, facilitating workshops and speaking on adaptive leadership. Dr. Abadian earned a Ph.D. degree in political economy and government studies from Harvard University, a master's in the anthropology and social change and development also from Harvard, as well as a M.P.A. degree in international development from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She has co-authored several books, Generative Cultural Renewal and Effective Research in Ending Female Genital Mutilation, Cutting and Other Harmful Practices. In 2022, she was a Fulbright Scholar in Specialist Program in Canada, consulting with First Nations on International Baccalaureate curriculum. She has So many laurels that I'm not going to go individually. You can go to her website, and she has a website, so everything is listed there. Let's go to the next slide, please. And that's her picture. Of course, you see her live. So I always like to put a picture of that. And again, this is a fire temple with the religious symbol, and she'll be talking about that. Next slide, please. So, although Zoroastrian religion is recognized as a religious minority, the followers of this faith in Iran continue to experience deep systemic discrimination in law, governance, and daily life. Zoroastrianism is the indigenous religion of Iran or Persia. The lecture by Dr. Sousan will trace these injustices from their historical origins of the Arab Islamic conquest of Persia to their modern manifestations. It will also highlight political and judicial inequities such as exclusion from senior government roles, minimal parliamentary representation and biased legal rulings, discriminatory inheritance laws that deprive actually the Zoroastrian people. Social long-standing stigmatization as impure has led to segregation, restrictions on the religious practice, surveillance of fire temples, and harassment related to cultural symbols like Faravahar. These pressures have contributed to demographic decline, migration, and deep sense of alienation in their ancestral homeland, while other Baha'i faith community faces most severe persecution. Zoroastrians and other minorities also endure significant violation of religious freedom. So we will hear from her, followed by some question and answers. Next slide, please. Again, the fire temple with fire. Next slide, please. This is the motto for ICHRRF, that we speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, speak up and judge fairly. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping announcements. I will request everyone with folded hands, keep yourself muted. Keep your cell phone on vibration mode. Please do not interrupt the distinguished speaker. Questions will be taken at the end. Please don't interrupt the speaker. All questions are moderated through the chat function. Please ask very precise questions. Don't send a lecture in the form of comments. This event is being recorded. It will be available as an educational resource on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. Those audience members who request a certificate of attendance, please request Christina Kalasunas, and her email address is there. And we do request our US-based audience to help and support us financially. We are a 501c3 organization, so all your donations are tax exempt. Without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to give the platform to Dr. Sousan Abadian. So Sousan, the platform is yours. Please start your presentation and you may start your own PowerPoint.
Yes, I'm going to ask Carl to put it on, but I want to first of all thank you so much about this topic. I am really grateful. I was on the program a few weeks ago to listen in on the female genital cutting discussion, which was very powerful. And then we met at that point in time. So I just want to appreciate so much that you've invited me to be here on this topic, and also appreciate the people who've shown up on a Sunday to listen in. I'm really grateful for all the listeners. I've just been getting texts from people who, for some reason, aren't able to join us, but I look forward to them listening to the recording. I wanted to just ask Carl if you don't mind putting on the first slide. And before I begin, I'm asking something of everyone who's listening now and in the future, almost like a covenant. I want nothing that I share tonight to be used to disrespect Muslims or to justify discrimination against any Muslim or Arab person or community. You know, I may speak about how Islam has been weaponized by states, by power, by conquest, but the answer is not tit for tat. truth, accountability, and a deeper commitment to human dignity. We do not heal trauma by transmitting it. And if you hear a hard truth, hold it with moral seriousness and also with compassion. You know, you still choose to treat others with dignity, with love. I know that goes without saying with this particular community, but I just want to reinforce that I don't want anything that I'm saying to be used as an excuse for disrespect. Now, this story is hard to tell for a few reasons. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Carl, I appreciate it. It's hard to tell for a few reasons. The first is fear. Many Zoroastrians, especially those with families still in Iran, are genuinely terrified of consequences. This is not an abstract concern. We're talking about a community that's already dangerously small. Some estimates place the number of Iranian Zoroastrians, those that remain in Iran, at around 15,000 people. The Islamic Republic is known for imprisoning thousands, sometimes 10,000 people at a time. It wouldn't be difficult for the state to intimidate, silence, or make life impossible for what remains of this ancient community. So silence is not cowardice. It is often a survival strategy. The second reason this topic is difficult to speak about is fear of misuse, what I've already said. I worry deeply that telling this truth will be used to justify hatred against Muslims and Arabs. And that fear is not imaginary. We've seen over and over again how pain can be weaponized, how histories of suffering can be twisted to justify new injustices. And this is precisely why I began tonight with a moral boundary. Nothing I share should be used to dehumanize Muslims or Arabs. And my commitment to dignity is not selective. It includes Muslims and Arabs. Some of the people I care about most, people I trust, respect, and walk alongside, were born Muslim, Arab. Again, the solution to historic injustice is not retaliation. It's the creation of real opportunities to tell the truth, to ask for accountability, space where this can be done openly, responsibly, and without abandoning compassion. Now, a third reason this is a hard story to tell is gaslighting and ideological backlash. So this is another kind of pressure that comes not from authoritarian regimes, but from public discourse. After a recent half-hour YouTube discussion on historic Zoroastrian persecution, some responses were not, that we saw on the YouTube, the comments, were not engagement, but dismissal and attack. Comments like, oh, paid by Zionist groups to spread anti-Muslim hate, or an Israeli tactic to distract from their own crimes, or simply, boo-hoo, stop crying and get over it. Now, this is gaslighting. It's refusal to sit with uncomfortable history, and it reframes testimony as conspiracy, pain as manipulation, and survival as inconvenient. Now, there's another layer here, particularly in parts of Europe and the West. Many progressives rightly carry guilt and self-reproach over the history of Western colonial history in Arab and Muslim majority countries. That reckoning is necessary, but sometimes that guilt turns into overcompensation, into reluctance to acknowledge Islamic imperial history or present-day religious inequality. And in trying to avoid Islamophobia, some end up whitewashing conquest, silencing minorities, or treating Islam only as a benign or misunderstood force, while those living under its politicized, weaponized forms pay the price. So let me say this plainly. Naming injustice is not hatred. Truth-telling is not bigotry. And refusing to look at history does not make us moral. It makes us complicit in silence. And there's one more dimension I want to name because it lives not just in ideas, but in bodies. For nearly 1,400 years, Zoroastrians learned, often through brutal experience, that the safest thing to do is to keep our heads down. Don't be visible. Don't attract attention. Don't speak too loudly about who you are. That kind of history doesn't disappear. It settles into the nervous system. It gets carried in families. It becomes instinct. And I'll be honest, even appearing here today, I had to work through fear that lives in my very bones. Speaking out is not just an intellectual act. It's an act of unlearning generations of caution that once kept people alive. And even though I appear here in my private role as a Zoroastrian and at one point in the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department and not as the head of the Interfaith Council, I do want to acknowledge a challenge within the interfaith world itself. Spaces I obviously care deeply about. We often in the interfaith world default to a language of harmony. We emphasize that we are all one human family. We focus on the positive. We smooth over the rough edges. And yes, we are one human family, but families hurt one another. And when harm happens inside a family, love does not mean pretending it didn't happen. This is a form of spiritual bypass that says, let's not talk about the pain. Let's not name misuse of power. Let's not dwell on the past. But when harm is ongoing, silence doesn't heal. It enables repetition. And what I'm hoping to model today is something different. Truth without cruelty, clarity without hatred, love without denial. We can't sweep this under the carpet, especially when the harm has not stopped. So this is the work of this talk. Next slide, please. Before we speak about conquest, persecution, or erasure, we need to remember what Zoroastrian Iran actually was. Zoroastrian Iran was among the most sophisticated societies of the ancient world, politically, ethically, and spiritually. This was not a peripheral culture awaiting civilization. It was a civilizational center. Under the Achaemenid Empire beginning in the 6th century BCE, Persia governed one of the largest and most diverse empires in history. It stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. What distinguished this empire was not only its scale, but its approach to power. Cyrus the Great and those who followed him, most notably Darius, governed through a principle that was radical for its time: rule without forced religious uniformity. Cyrus is remembered for allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and restore their religious life. Most famously, he financed and authorized the return of the Jewish people from Babylonian exile and supported the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. This was not an isolated gesture. The Achaemenid administration also supported the restoration of temples in Babylon and Egypt, respecting local religious traditions rather than erasing them. Persian rulers did not impose their own sacred architecture on top of conquered people's holy sites, a pattern that would become tragically common in later imperial histories. Power was exercised with restraint and difference was accommodated rather than obliterated. This governing ethos was deeply shaped by Zoroastrian ethical philosophy. At the heart of Zoroastrianism is the concept of asha, truth, moral order, and right relationship. Human beings are understood as moral agents responsible for choosing truth over falsehood. The well-known triad, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, is not a slogan, but a disciplined ethical system that insists on integrity between intention, speech, and action. And this worldview also shaped interreligious life and intellectual is not widely known, but the Babylonian Talmud, the central text of rabbinic Judaism, was composed largely in Sasanian Zoroastrian Persia. Jewish communities lived for centuries under Persian rule, and scholars have long noted Zoroastrian influence on Jewish theological developments. And early Christian thought was likewise shaped through prolonged contact with Zoroastrian ideas, particularly concepts of ethical dualism, responsibility, and the eventual restoration of moral order. So these ideas entered Jewish and Christian theology not through conquest, but through centuries of intellectual and cultural exchange in Persian lands. Now, Zoroastrian society also articulated a strong ethic of stewardship toward the natural world. Fire, water, earth, and air were treated not as resources to be exploited, but as sacred trusts. This ethic shaped Persian approaches to agriculture, urban planning, and infrastructure, including sophisticated water management systems and road networks that bound the empire together. Importantly, and often overlooked, women in Zoroastrian society held a relatively strong and dignified status for the ancient world. Women could own property, enter contracts, inherit wealth, exercise religious authority within family and ritual life. While not fully egalitarian by modern standards, Zoroastrian culture affirmed women's moral agency and social participation in ways that contrasted sharply with many contemporaneous societies and with all those that would follow later. So when we speak of Iranian identity today, its reverence for light, its celebration of Nowruz, its ethical poetry, its deep concern with truth and justice, and Sufi mysticism, we're speaking in part of Zoroastrian foundations. These values predate Islam, survived conquest, and continue to animate Iranian culture. even when their origins are no longer acknowledged. It's really essential to understand that Zoroastrian Iran was not a marginal or primitive society awaiting civilization. It was a sophisticated, ethical, political, and intellectual world, one that shaped science, art, governance, law, theology, and moral responsibility across traditions. It's important to remember the ethical and civilizational depth of Zoroastrian Iran because conquest did not merely reorder power, it also imposed a narrative that nothing of value existed before the advent of Islam, that Islam alone brought civilization. In the process, centers of learning were destroyed, libraries disappeared, and many custodians of knowledge and cultural memory were killed or silenced. What follows then is not simply a change of rulers, it's the beginning of a long process by which an ancient civilizational tradition was subordinated, displaced from power, and gradually rendered second class in the land it had helped build. Next slide, please. To understand how such a civilization could be overtaken and how this erasure became possible, we need to look honestly at the extraordinary convergence of crises Iran was facing in the early 7th century. This was not a moment of cultural inferiority or moral decay. It was a moment of profound exhaustion. The Sasanian Empire had endured for over 4 centuries, from the 3rd to the 7th century CE. And for much of that time, it was a remarkably stable, administratively sophisticated, and powerful state. Well, what I'm going to be describing here is not the character of the entire empire, but the distinction matters because the Sasanians themselves had already demonstrated extraordinary cultural resilience. They had successfully reconstituted Iranian identity and Zoroastrian religious life after an earlier trauma, the violent conquest of Persia by Alexander of Macedon. Remembered in Persian historical memory, by the way, not as the Great, but as a devastating and destructive force, and the subsequent period of Hellenistic Greek-dominated rule. Following that upheaval, the Sasanians consciously revived Zoroastrian institutions, restored religious authority, and reasserted Iranian cultural and ethical traditions. But it's important to note that what they rebuilt was not a perfect restoration of the original teachings. Much had been destroyed during the Greek conquest, texts lost, wisdom lineage broken, practices interrupted. What emerged was a Zoroastrianism shaped in part by historical trauma, a tradition reconstituted under pressure, carrying both continuity and distortion. In other words, this was a civilization that had already survived conquest and had rebuilt itself, imperfectly, but with a remarkable resilience. By the early 600s, however, the Sasanian state had been locked in centuries of devastating war with the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. These were not brief conflicts, but prolonged grinding campaigns that drained treasuries, hollowed out infrastructure, and exhausted entire generations. To finance these endless wars, the state imposed what were, over time, crushing levels of taxation on farmers and local communities. The countryside bore the cost of imperial ambition. Economic strain mounted year after year, possibly eroding loyalty to the state and leaving people increasingly desperate. If we're looking for a modern long military conflicts, the so-called forever wars, wars that stretched on for decades, draining public resources, destabilizing entire regions, and leaving ordinary people to bear the costs long after political leaders move on. Now imagine not 20 or 30 years of such warfare, but hundreds. Only in later periods of the Sasanian Empire did Iran experience severe internal political instability, rapid successions of rulers, court intrigue, and civil strife that fractured authority precisely when cohesion was most needed. This instability emerged sharply in the final 2 to 3 decades before the conquest, intensifying in the years immediately preceding it, and worsened by a devastating plague. Around 627 to 628 CE, the plague of Shiro swept through the region. It killed vast numbers of people, including much of the ruling elite, further destabilizing an already weakened society. And overlaying all of this were environmental and climatic disruptions, years of abnormal cold, heavy rainfall, crop failure, and famine. These conditions undermined food security and intensified social stress. And when people are hungry, grieving, overtaxed, and exhausted, the capacity to resist external forces collapses. So when Arab Muslim forces entered Iranian territory, they did not encounter a flourishing empire at its height. They encountered a civilization already brought to its knees by war, taxation, late-stage political fragmentation, plague, ecological stress, and economic exhaustion. And even in this weakened state, Iranians did not simply submit. They resisted fiercely. Across multiple regions, cities and communities fought back, and many tens of thousands were killed in the process, cities wiped out, often in brutal reprisals when resistance was. Context matters deeply. It challenges the narrative that Islam brought civilization to a barbaric or decadent land. What entered Iran was not simply a new faith, but a conquering power that encountered a society already shattered by forces beyond its control. Understanding this helps us see how conquest, erasure, and long-term subjugation became possible. Next slide, please. Conquest did not only reorder political power, it also profoundly reshaped cultural memory. One of the lasting consequences of the Arab Muslim conquest of Iran was the systematic displacement of Persian language, knowledge, and cultural authorship within the new imperial order. Arabic was imposed as the language of governance, law, and scholarship, and over time, this relegated Persian, and with it much of Zoroastrian intellectual and ethical vocabulary, to the margins of public life. This linguistic shift was not neutral. As Persian libraries were destroyed, neglected, or absorbed into new imperial centers, vast bodies of pre-Islamic learning, history, philosophy, cosmology, medicine, ethics, were lost or severed from their original context. And at the same time, many elements of Iranian civilization did not disappear. They were absorbed, reframed, and rebranded. Persian administrative systems, scientific knowledge, artistic traditions, poetry, architecture, and court culture became foundational to what later came to be called Islamic civilization, often without acknowledgement of their Zoroastrian or Persian origins. Iranian scholars, physicians, poets, astronomers contributed enormously to these traditions, yet their work was frequently claimed as Islamic rather than recognized as Persian or Zoroastrian in origin. This process produced a double erasure. Zoroastrians were marginalized within their own homeland, while of that homeland were appropriated and universalized under a new religious identity. Over time, this made it possible to claim that Islam had brought civilization to Iran, when in fact it had inherited, transformed, and often obscured a much older one. And as Arab Muslim forces consolidated control over Iran, Zoroastrians were gradually repositioned from members of a civilization majority to a religious minority living under a new legal and moral order. Now, this transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded unevenly over generations through a mix of coercion, legal restructuring, and economic pressure and social stigmatization. Zoroastrians were incorporated into what later came to be known as the dhimmi system. I don't actually know how to pronounce it, dhimmi system, a framework that granted limited protection in exchange for clear subordination. They were permitted to survive, but not to flourish on equal terms. Their religion was tolerated, but marked as inferior. This shift had concrete consequences. Zoroastrians were subjected to special taxes, including the jizya, which functioned not only as a revenue mechanism, but as a constant reminder of unequal status. Conversion to Islam brought relief from these burdens, creating powerful incentives that reshaped families and communities over time. Legal inequality followed. In many periods, Zoroastrian testimony carried less weight than that of Muslims. Access to positions of authority was restricted. Public visibility of religious life was constrained. What had once been a worldview shaping governance and ethics was pushed inward into homes, villages, and guarded sacred spaces. Equally damaging was the social dimensions of subordination. Zoroastrians were increasingly portrayed as ritually impure, or morally suspect. This stigmatization did not always take the form of violence. Often it worked through everyday humiliations, exclusions, and enforced over time, it trained people to lower their gaze, limit their aspirations, and expect less from public life. It is also important to correct a persistent myth. There's a widespread tendency to say that Iranians welcomed or embraced Islam. I heard the euphemism of Iran embracing Islam the other day at a talk hosted by Stanford's Hoover Institute. I want to be very clear about this. Conquest should not be confused with consent. Islam did not arrive in Iran as a freely chosen spiritual awakening. It arrived through military defeat, legal subordination, economic pressure, and social coercion, unfolding over generation. In most cases, conversions followed not because people were persuaded, but because survival demanded it. In other words, non-Muslim communities, including Zoroastrians, were permitted to exist, but not as equals. They were subject to special taxes, legal disadvantages, and social restrictions that made full participation in public life impossible. Conversions occurred not out of spiritual enthusiasm, but because the costs of remaining outside the dominant faith were simply too high. To describe that process as an embrace is to mistake a will to survive for enthusiasm and adaptation for agreement. And yet, despite all of this, Zoroastrianism did not disappear. Communities adapted, rituals were preserved, ethical teachings were transmitted within families, sacred fires were tended with care. What could no longer be expressed publicly was carried inward, generation after generation. This marks the beginning of the long arc of Zoroastrian subordination in Iran. Not a single act of destruction, but a slow narrowing of space, legal, social, economic, and spiritual. Understanding this arc is essential because many of the dynamics set in motion during this period did not end with the medieval era. They echo forward into the modern state and in Zoroastrians in Iran today. It's also important to note that this subordination was not uniform across time. There were periods when conditions for Zoroastrians were better and others worsened dramatically. And one of the most devastating came in the 16th century when the Safavid state imposed 12-verse Shiism as Iran's official religion. To understand the scale of what followed, it helps to remember what came before. So at its height, during the Sasanian period, the Iranian world constituted approximately 44% of the world's population, the vast majority of whom were Zoroastrian. And even prior to the Safavid imposition of Shiism, Zoroastrians, while they were long marginalized, still numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and even some estimates over 1 million across different regions of Iran. But under the Safavids, persecution intensified threshold. What had previously been a system of legal inferiority and economic coercion was now repeatedly enforced through open violence. Zoroastrians were subjected not only to forced conversion, punitive taxation, and legal subordination, but also to organized attacks, pogroms, and episodes of mass killings, often carried out with the knowledge or active participation of local authorities. Entire communities were targeted and wiped out. Homes were destroyed, sacred spaces desecrated, people killed or driven out with impunity. Violence was used to deliberately terrorize survivors into conversion, flight, or submission. And this submission was enforced not only through law and economics, but through public humiliation. Zoroastrians were forced to wear visible markers identifying them as non-Muslim, often yellow patches or distinctive clothing designed to make them instantly recognizable, socially vulnerable, and subject to harassment and abuse. These markings ensured that exclusion was constant, visible, and inescapable. By 1854, after centuries of cumulative pressure and intensified persecution, only recorded 7,711 Zoroastrian remaining in Iran, concentrated largely in the desert regions of Yazd and Kerman, living as social untouchables, marginalized and exposed. This was not a natural demographic shift. It reflected forced conversions, flight, economic strangulation, episodic mass violence, and the systematic erosion of any conditions necessary for communal survival. Many Zoroastrians were pushed to the absolute margins of society, and in our memory, in communal memory, this period is remembered as nearly annihilating the Zoroastrian presence within Iran. That Zoroastrianism survived at all, that I am here today, is itself an extraordinary and inspiring story, a miracle, but one for another time. Okay, slide 6, please. Before we move into the modern Islamic Republic, I want to make what it meant to be second class concrete, not just as an idea. So it was enforced in the smallest, most intimate details of daily life. For example, for centuries, Zoroastrians were marked as ritually impure. This idea of impurity was not abstract. It governed how one could move through the most ordinary spaces of life. In many places, Zoroastrians were not permitted to touch fruit or produce in the marketplace, lest they render them impure for Muslims. They were not allowed to drink from common water fountains. Access to water, life itself, was regulated by religious hierarchy. They were forbidden to ride horses because riding would place them physically higher than Muslim. Their homes were required to be lower than those of their Muslim neighbors. And even in the rain, Zoroastrians were often not permitted to step outside because, God forbid, water dripping from them was considered contaminating and thought to pollute shared streams and rivers. These were not symbolic rules. They were deliberate practices of domination enforced day after day in markets, streets, and neighborhoods. They taught one group that it was entitled and taught another that it must yield, step aside, and remain exposed. Over time, this system did more than restrict Zoroastrians. It actively produced hierarchy, cultivating arrogance in those positioned above and enforcing vulnerability on those pushed below, until inequality itself came to be experienced as natural rather than recognized as an imposed injustice. At the legal and economic level, systems like the jizya enforced this vulnerability. The tax was not only a financial burden, it functioned as a signal of subordinate status. If people could not afford to pay, they had to convert or be jailed and physically punished. And critically, it offered no reliable guarantee of safety. Protection was conditional, uneven, and often dependent on the goodwill of local authorities. And when that protection failed, minorities had little recourse. So what this meant in practice was a kind of chronic insecurity. Most of the time, life continued quietly, but at moments during political upheaval, economic stress, or religious fervor, conditions could shift rapidly. Periods of relative tolerance could give way to intimidation, harassment, or violence, often without consequence for the perpetrators. I mean, even up to my mother and uncles described men on horseback riding into their village, men who faced no consequences, kidnapping young Zoroastrian girls, raping them, and forcing them into marriage. Families had no protection. There was no authority to appeal to. Silence was often the only way to survive. And these stories are not anomalies. They appear again and again in oral histories and community records, including those preserved by Fazana, Zoroastrian institution. Kidnappings, forced conversions, localized terror, especially during periods when minorities had no protection and violence went unpunished. And these stories are not told to shock. They're told because they are uncomfortable historical facts and because they explain why silence, caution, and invisibility became survival strategies. When your survival and safety depend on not being noticed, you learn to disappear in plain sight. This is what it meant to live as a Zoroastrian in Iran for centuries. Not always constant massacre, but constant exposure. Not perpetual violence, but permanent vulnerability. A life shaped by restraint, vigilance, and the knowledge that one's status could worsen overnight. Holding this lived reality helps us understand both the endurance of the community and the deep psychological and cultural costs of surviving as second class in one's ancestral homeland. The fear that still lives in the body and the silence that many Iranian Zoroastrians have carried across generations. Next slide, please. Before turning fully to the Islamic Republic, it's important to acknowledge a crucial historic interlude. During the Pahlavi era in the 20th century, Zoroastrians in Iran experienced a period of relative liberation, freed for the first time in over a millennium from a long-standing stranglehold on their lives. This is not full equality, and discrimination did not disappear since While laws changed quickly, social prejudice, especially in the conservative rural areas, often lagged behind law. But for the first time in centuries, the state was officially secular, and religious identity was no longer the primary determinant of legal status. Importantly, religiously based taxation was abolished during that period. Zoroastrians were no longer taxed as non-Muslims, but as citizens of a secular state. For a community that had been economically marked and burdened for centuries, the shift was profoundly consequential, even if its effects were uneven and took time to fully be felt. Zoroastrians were able to participate more openly in public life. They entered professions previously closed to them. They founded schools, civic institutions, and cultural organizations. And many recall this period as one in which they could finally stand upright, speak openly, and imagine a future in Iran without fear. Now, again, Pahlavi regime was not faultless, but it had these benefits for Zoroastrians. But that opening ended abruptly in 1979. With the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979, the brief opening of the Pahlavi area was decisively reversed. A secular civic framework gave way to a theocratic state in which religious hierarchy once again became a central determinant of legal status, rights, and belonging. Zoroastrians are constitutionally recognized as a religious minority, but recognition is not equality. And before I go further, I want to name something important. It feels difficult and even uncomfortable to speak about discrimination against Zoroastrians at a time when so many Iranians, Baha'is, and including Muslims, and especially women, are suffering profoundly under the system. So the intention here is not to compete in suffering or to suggest that Zoroastrians are uniquely victimized. Rather, it's to show how a system built on religious hierarchy harms many groups in different ways and how minorities experience its effects with particular force. So under the Islamic Republic, Zoroastrians are barred from senior government, judicial, and military positions. They can't serve as judges or even public school principals. These exclusions are not about competence. They're based explicitly on religious identity. It's also important to be precise about taxation and law. The Islamic Republic doesn't impose a tax explicitly called jizya. That term belongs to an earlier legal era. However, the logic of jizya, religious hierarchy, expressed through other mechanisms. One area where this appears is blood money, or diya. Historically, Iranians' law valued the life of a Muslim more highly than that of a non-Muslim. While limited reforms in recent decades have attempted to equalize compensation through insurance mechanism, equality is not grounded in an unconditional principle of equal citizenship and remains inconsistently applied in practice. And legal inequality also appear in court testimony. In cases involving Muslims and non-Muslims, Zoroastrian testimony may carry less weight or require corroboration, depending on the judge and the circumstances. Outcomes can vary widely, but the underlying framework privileges Muslim authority. And perhaps the most devastating form of inequality appears in inheritance law. If a Zoroastrian family member converts to Islam, that individual may inherit the entire estate, effectively disinheriting non-Muslim relatives. This law exerts intense economic and psychological pressure and has fractured families from within. Conversion once again carries material reward. So religious practices, they're permitted but closely monitored. Fire temples and community gatherings are surveilled. Public expressions of Zoroastrian identity are constrained. Cultural symbols may be harassed. The message is clear: presence is tolerated, visibility is risky. These patterns are not anecdotal. They are consistently documented by UN special rapporteurs on freedom of religion or belief and by the US Department of State's annual reports, which notes systematic legal inequality and restrictions on religious minorities in Iran, including Zoroastrians. What we see here is not the invention of a new system, but the re-entrenchment of an old one, updated for a modern state. Zoroastrians are allowed to exist, but not to belong fully, to practice quietly, but not to participate equally, to survive, but not to flourish. And again, this does not happen in isolation. The same structures that subordinate religious minorities also constrain women, silent dissent, and punish difference more broadly. Understanding how these hierarchies operate across communities is essential if we are serious about justice. And today, only a small remnant of Zoroastrians remain in Iran. Many have left, others stay quiet, all live with the knowledge that their citizenship is conditional. So I want to close by returning to why this history matters. What I've shared today is not simply a record of past injustice, nor an indictment of a people or a faith. It is an account of how a system of religious hierarchy, when embedded in law and power, shape whose lives are protected, whose voices are trusted, and whose dignity is conditional. Zoroastrians have carried this history for centuries, 1400 years, often quiet out of fear, often out of love for their country, and often out of deep reluctance to see truth used as a weapon against others. That silence should not be mistaken for consent, nor endurance for acceptance. And the call here again is not for retaliation, it's not humiliation, it's not tit for tat. The call is recognition, to name what has happened and what continues to happen with clarity and compassion, and to remember that a society's moral health can be measured by how it treats those who are few, quiet, and vulnerable. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest living ethical traditions. Its survival is not an accident, it is the result of extraordinary resilience. But resilience should not be the price of belonging. Justice, if it is to mean anything, must make room not only for the powerful and the many, but for those who have been asked for far too long to live as second class in their own homeland. If there's a call to action here, it's not abstract, it's very human. One way is to stand in solidarity, is to help garner resources for the Zoroastrians who remain in Iran. Elderly communities, families living quietly, often invisibly under increasing pressure. And another is to support Zoroastrian immigrants and refugees here in the United States, many of whom arrive carrying generations of trauma, loss, and dislocation, and who are rebuilding their lives with dignity but limited support. Solidarity in this sense is not about slogans, it's about showing up materially, relationally, and with care. Anyway, I think I'll end now. I think we're getting close to our time, and if there are any questions, I want to be able to respond to them. Thank you for listening today and being available for this discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Sousan. I must say that you are a very brave person. Indeed, very brave person, because your role as Director of Interfaith Council in Washington, D.C. puts you at a tremendous risk to talk about issues that are politically incorrect and uncomfortable. And yes, you have enlightened us quite a lot as to what was the story of Zoroastrians in Iran. And I must say that, although the attendance is not very great, but we have people from 4 different continents listening to your lecture, not just from United States, but from Europe, from Asia, and from Africa. So we have people all over the world listening to your story, and it's an important story that must be told, not for the fear of political correctness. So you deserve our kudos. You deserve congratulations for being very, very ethical, very, very moral, and yet being able to communicate this story of pain. I must say that historically I am aware of all these things because there used to be a large but highly successful Zoroastrian community in India that led in every sphere of life to the extent that they controlled a business conglomerate. Unfortunately, they were so successful that their total fecundity rate went down and they are becoming smaller and smaller. And they are called actually Parsis in India, but they are essentially Zoroastrian people who escaped Iran, who escaped Persia when the persecution started. And those people have been living in India in the state of Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Kerala since 7th century onwards, and they are model citizens. So we understand the story you are talking about. That is understandable. But again, thanks a lot for your bravery that you decided to come and tell your story. We have a few questions, so we'll go through those questions. First is from Mr. Dirkling from Germany, and he wants to know, are there groups in Iran who try to help Zoroastrians, like, people who are Sufis or Alawite sect people, you know, uh, who are also kind of threatened by the dominant conservative Shiite sects?
The question, first of all, thank you for uh, acknowledging that it took some, I don't know what to call it, courage, or I did hesitate to give this talk, I have to admit, given my current role, but I'm speaking as a private citizen here and someone who was in the human rights world at one point, not as the director of, though of course I wear that hat all the time. But truth is truth. I mean, and it's not, I mean, I'm trying to model how to share the truth, but from a place of also love. I mean, it's complicated. And in any case, I haven't spoken publicly about this before in this way. But the question of, I think the question was whether there's assistance from within the country to these. I mean,
Yes.
there's definitely a center, a Zoroastrian self-help center within Iran that is helping Zoroastrians, but also the diaspora is helping. And you mentioned the Parsis. We're so proud of our Parsi contingents who left Iran 1,000 years ago as religious refugees, and beloved India. I mean, bless India, absorbed the Zoroastrians that to live and then flourish. The Zoroastrians flourished there and contributed immensely to Indian culture and civilization. Anyway, so we're very proud of our Parsis. And they left 1,000 years ago. They left Iran 1,000 years ago, and they saved Iranians. By the way, the untold story of how Zoroastrian survived is, thank goodness for our Parsi relatives who came to our rescue in the 1800s. Anyway, again, that's another story. But they have been helpful also to Zoroastrians in Iran, funneling resources to them as well. So there is some of that going on.
There is a question by Mr. Clements, who is our executive director. After the fall of Soviet Union, there were signs of Zoroastrian revival in Tajikistan. What became of
that? It's such a good question. It's, converting out of Islam is a death sentence in most cultures. So it's hard to really know what's going on. What we do know is that Zoroastrianism has revived in Kurdistan, in many parts of the so-called the Persianic, that what used to be the Persianic sphere in Afghanistan used to be Zoroastrian and Buddhist, believe it or not, before Islamic conquest. So that whole region, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Iraq, Pakistan, they were the Persianic sphere of influence, and a lot of them were Zoroastrian. So there is some revival of Zoroastrianism where it's pop, but it's quiet because converting out of Islam is a death sentence. So very few people can overtly do that. I mean, really, in the West and Europe, we have Zoroastrianism happening in Europe. We have it in North America, South America, even, and many parts of the world. But yeah, so there is, and Kurdistan, there's some movement in Kurdistan as well. We have actually some Zoroastrians on the line. If they want to also add to the conversation, they can. They may know more than I do about some of these topics. But thank you for the question.
Okay, since you threw this challenge, maybe I will ask Nawaz Merchant.
Without putting anybody on the spot.
Nawaz, do you want to make any comments?
No, I would just thank Sousan for that wonderful summary of our history. And I actually put I acknowledge all that she has said, and her answer is excellent. Looking back on past laurels in India, while very gratifying, I think what I want to take away from this lecture is a cautionary tale. If a religion dominates in a geography, what is the result? So that was my question for Sousan. What can we learn from this history that warns us about the present erosion of the separation of church and state. We've seen it, right? It's already happened. You have a multi-century history before you, and yet we're seeing it happening again.
Wow, that's
Before,
another tricky
before
question for
Suzanne, before you answer that, I want to bring one more person, Nivia Salman. You want to comment?
Also, I want to notice that Faravahar Rahnaman is also on the, and he's an Iranian Zoroastrian as well. So I just want to just mention that he's there. But let's hear from Nevia, who I deeply admire. Tell me, Nevia, hi.
Hello. Let me see if there's so yeah, so I'm Jewish and I'm really curious, what does respectful allyship look like from your community's point of view, and what are common misunderstandings you wish that allies in the interfaith world of different religious traditions would avoid? And in a more personal note, do you see a future for like diasporic Jewish and Zoroastrian solidarity movements or communities in sorts of ways?
Wow, what great questions. And and allyship is such a great question. I haven't thought deeply enough about it, to tell you the truth. But yes, there's lots of ways, including just stop talking about Iran as having embraced it. I mean, just the way the euphemisms that the West uses drive me nuts. It's like they're erasing our history. And just because they want to look so supportive and progressive, and it's like, okay, we can love Muslims, we can love what's happened, but let's not deny what happened also. I mean, I think that's just people to be more careful about the language. Excuse me. But there's also just understanding of what Iranians have been through as a people. I mean, Iranians have gone through so much trauma, historical trauma. Allyship between Jews and Iranians are natural, in my view. I mean, it's a natural, we've been, the first superpower that supported the Israelis was not America, it was Iran. So it was the Zoroastrian Empire. That was the first superpower that supported Jews and Israelis forever. I mean, from the beginning. So, and not that I'm proud of what Ben Netanyahu's doing right now. I mean, I have very mixed feelings about I don't like what's happening. I mean, all that stuff. I don't want to get into political discussion, but Jews and Iranians and Zoroastrians are natural allies, as are Arabs. I mean, I don't see any. We are one family, and these distinctions are ridiculous at this point in time. And we're going to be more and more one family. I mean, it's these boundaries and distinctions. I don't know. Anyway, I think we're all allies of each other. I'm allies. There's nobody who's not an ally to me, in my view.
Before I end the session, I will take this opportunity.
And also, I just wanted to just say one thing to Nawaz's point, which is a really important point. And actually, I shouldn't speak to it because we're supposed to be not affiliated politically but again, I'm not speaking from my hat of interfaith counsel. But she's absolutely right that when religion takes over and considers itself it doesn't respect the dignity of other faith traditions, or doesn't see other faith traditions as equal to its own, it's problematic, as we're seeing it's somewhat in parts of the world right now, including the West.
So before I end the session, I will try to give an opportunity to Fair-Bors, who is sitting in Iran, if he wants to make any
He's in
comments.
Canada.
Fair-Bors,
you're in Canada, right? Not in Iran, but you're Iranian, I know. But
I don't see any response, but I would like to give an opportunity if he were to make a comment.
Faravahar, you're on mute if you want to say something. You're muted.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself and say, make your comments. Okay, we don't have
anyway,
him.
he can't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My heartfelt thanks to Suzanne for this very educational lecture, telling the story of, historical pain and trauma. I again am very appreciative that you have a job that puts you at risk, talking even in your personal capacity, anybody can bring it out, but I think the story has to be told. We cannot be the deniers of history, what happened. Again, idea is not finger pointing. ICHRRF provides a platform to the voiceless. We are the voice of voiceless. We are not afraid of anyone. We are not politically correct. We want the preservation of all the ancient indigenous traditions, wherever in the world they may be. And in that sense, we support you, Sousan. Hopefully, we will continue to work with you. Maybe we will have much more contemporary discussion about the diaspora in Europe and North America for a future talk. But really, I'm very, very impressed with your very detailed and lucid lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very
And
much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if I lose my job, you'll need to hire me. I'm teasing.
This lecture would be available on our website and YouTube channel as an educational resource. As we have said that we have a fellowship training program, so our fellows will learn from this. So again, very, very thankful. Thank you very much indeed. And we have run out of our time, so we are going to end this meeting.
If we could just 1 second, it looks like Faravahar is off of mute. I know anyone who has to leave, please leave. But if Faravahar wants to have the last word, do you mind if we give it to him now that he's
No, I don't mind.
Please.
I see he's off mute.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
I couldn't get my microphone on. I had to go out and come back. So, Sousan, it was a very inspiring lecture. Thank you very much. And luckily, the present regime has brought Zoroastrianism back to Iran. The people of Iran are claiming their ancestral right to the religion, which is a very positive sign.
Yeah.
The first positive sign in 1400 years.
They've done us a great favor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Faravahar. This is in my field is called reaction formation. So the Persian society in collective reaction formation is going back to their ancestral roots and history and rediscovering Zoroastrianism. And my understanding is that a lot of them are silently going back to Zoroastrianism. That's the story I hear. So with that good note, let's end this meeting and let's give a round of applause to Sousan.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.